Welcome back to Major Antonio's presentation of The Last Days of Fort Vaux by Henry Bordeaux. Book 5, The Denouement. 1. The German Account.
On June 7th, at 10 to 4 in the morning, Fort Vaux was still breathing. A German account of its last agonies, and its death doctored, no doubt, to suit the German public, but nevertheless paying a tribute of respect to the defenders, was published in the Breisgauer Zeitung of June 16th, 17th, and 18th. The first part is dated June 4th, the second, June 7th. It is signed by one of the war correspondents admitted to the Great General Headquarters, Kurt von Redden, but it is dated from the Great General Headquarters of the attacking troops, and it is easy to guess from certain details that it was revised, if not actually written, by the staff. Here is the complete text of the enemy version. Quote, Part 1. General Headquarters of the attacking troops northeast of Vaux, June 4. On June 2nd, at 4 o'clock in the morning, the 4 attacking companies were drawn up in a semicircle round Fort Vaux, at about 100 yards distance. At one swoop, they pushed forward even to the ditch, which 10 yards broad and 5 deep encloses the whole earthwork in the form of an irregular trapezoid within its sheer walls built of large square stones. Across the appalling curtain fire of the French, we had only been able to convey a part of our war material up to the heights of the fort: flamethrowers, hand grenades, axes, and wire cutters. In consequence of the long bombardment with heavy guns, the fort, though very massively built, was no longer capable of defending the surrounding space effectively. But the dugouts, hollowed out deep in the rocks and covered with reinforced concrete, had held out. The flanking transverse passages of the fort, too, were still factors to be reckoned with. Accordingly, the first problem was to make their artillery and machine guns harmless, for these, with their raking fire, churned up the bottom of the ditch and prevented us from crossing and reaching the interior of the fort. Each of the 2 breastworks in front showed an open breach, caused by very heavy projectiles in the gigantic blocks of concrete of which they were formed. The damage was repaired, up to a point, by sandbags, and to protect the breach, they had placed there a machine gun which might be able to operate towards the glacis. The principal obstacle, however, was still the guns of the transverse passages, which from their narrow concrete embrasures could sweep the short line of the ditches with a pitiless fire. Access to either of the breastworks was impeded by the fire of a 37mm revolving gun, a 55mm gun, and by 2 machine guns. Not a cat could have passed through. First of all, the machine gun, which at the very breach prevented our approach, was silenced by hand grenades. Then the pioneers crept right up to the upper edge of the escarped wall, above the western transverse passage, set up the flamethrowers, and from above, with the aid of a crankshaft, inserted the tubes of the flamethrowers into the embrasures. A flame of 2 yards, accompanied by dense smoke, drove the garrison far away from its guns. At this point, some 30 pioneers, taking advantage of the breaches in the masonry, contrived to get down into the ditch and, on the other side, to reach the top of the main parapet, where they lay down and improvised a sort of shelter in the rubbish heap. This little band was at once cut off. The French having reopened fire with the machine guns, these made a retreat impossible for them, while in the transverse gallery the smoke had dispersed. In the tremendous din of the German curtain fire, about 200 yards behind the fort, cries could not be heard at 20 yards. The officer in command had to signal with his cap, which he waved in the Morse code. At 7 a.m., we succeeded in capturing the second transverse gallery, the eastern one, after which the garrison, through a breach made by the shells, was nearly overwhelmed by a bomb attack. 30 men were captured, and the machine guns, with an abundance of munitions, fell into our hands and were made use of. But in the case of the other transverse gallery, the smoke had only counteracted the effects of its fire for a brief spell. It was therefore essential to take it, no matter how. Bags were filled with hand grenades and passed along the wall until in front of the embrasures, where they were made to explode. This, however, could not be done without considerable risk to the brave pioneers, for the French had placed another machine gun in a doorway not far from the embrasures, and could thus shoot from below at any head overlapping the upper edge of the wall. For all that, about 5 p.m., the explosions were successful, and we were at last able to penetrate into the transverse gallery which we had first attacked. The garrison, by a deep corridor passing underneath the bottom of the ditch, had taken refuge in the interior of the fort. It had been a lengthy operation, for the explosives, in view of the French curtain fire, could only be placed on the slope in small quantities, and even then the danger was terrible. During the interval of waiting, the pioneers and the infantrymen, who were not working directly at the explosives, dug trenches above, on the glacis, and farther west by the side of the fort. They occupied these positions with the machine guns taken from the enemy to meet a possible attack from the southwest. About 7 p.m., we pushed forward towards the gorge of the fort, after crossing, behind the first parapet, the second ditch, which under the bombardment had become a wide excavation containing enormous masses of shattered concrete. The armed turrets on the first parapet, an observing station at each of the two breastworks, a big cupola in the middle, provided with 2 guns, and a raised and armored machine gun shelter at the left-hand breastwork, were unfit for further use and stripped of their thick revetment of concrete. The iron rods of the framework stuck out all over them like the prickles of a hedgehog. In the same way, the infantry position higher up on the cavalier had been completely ripped up by the German shells. At this point, the officer commanding the pioneers wanted to make his way into the earthwork itself, and that by the same underground passage which the defenders of the smoked-out transverse gallery had followed. There was a deep stairway, then a short landing, then a steep flight of stairs going up to a stout oaken door, which prevented one from going farther. Pioneer Lieutenant Ruberg decided to blow up this door by putting against it all the hand grenades required, and taking advantage of the ensuing confusion to storm the position with his troops. In order that the force might not itself be wiped out by the explosion, it was essential that it should gain enough time to be able, once the match was lighted, to go down the staircase and climb up the other side. This would necessitate a cord burning at least 20 seconds. Lieutenant Ruberg, for want of explosive petards, accordingly tied together a dozen grenades. He was fastening them up against the heavy door, when he heard behind it a whispering on the part of the French, and the slight crackle that denotes a Bickford cord. There was no time left to think matters over, for in half a minute at the most, the door would blow up from inside. And in that case, the French would have the moral superiority in the assault. The great thing was to anticipate them. The lieutenant motioned to his men to be on their guard, pulled out the normal detonator of one of the hand grenades, which acts in 5 seconds, and rushed to the foot of the staircase in order not to be blown to pieces. When he was halfway, a formidable explosion took place. The charge laid by the French, acted upon by the other, exploded simultaneously. The pressure of the air threw the lieutenant a few yards farther, and he received several splinters in his back. His pioneers darted forward into the corridor and reached a crossing, but were then confronted by 2 machine guns placed at about a right angle 10 paces to the rear, so that it became impossible to push on any farther. They had to possess their souls in patience throughout the night. From now on, there were 2 commandants of Fort Vaux, a French commandant below ground and a German commandant above him. The French could not poke their heads out anywhere without being greeted at once with bullets or bombs, and the Germans, for the time being, were unable to advance. A horrible stench emanated from all the open cracks in the ceiling of the casemates. The corpses of the French killed in the previous fighting still lay there. There was no means of either pulling them out or of burying them in the thick, hard stone. In the course of the night, a dozen French tried to find a way out. Some of them were killed, others taken prisoners by outposts placed at the southwest of the fort. On June 3rd, at 5 o'clock, a French airman flew above the earthwork in order to reconnoiter the position with accuracy. He came down very low, perhaps 100 yards above the ground, in order to see better, but he flew with such zigzags and so rapidly that the sensitive spot, the heart of the aeroplane, could not be hit in those few seconds. He made his escape, and 10 minutes later, a withering shell fire of 22 centimeters burst upon the trenches of the gorge which we were occupying, so that we had to take refuge as quickly as possible in the casemates that we had captured. Today, June 4th, is the fourth day that the fort has been shared by the two sides. The French are within like mutinous prisoners defending themselves against their warders. It is a situation which has never been prolonged to such an extent in the whole history of fortress warfare. The conduct of the French garrison is admirable, but still more admirable is the heroism of the German companies, which day and night, without a wink of sleep, without a drop of water, almost without food, withstand the most terrific fire, and will not let go their hold until this last corner of the underground passages of Vaux is in our hands. Kurt von Redden, Part 2, delayed in transmission and mutilated by the censor. General Headquarters of the attacking troops northeast of Vaux, June 7th. For 5 days and 5 nights, the terrific combat has been raging without respite in the interior of Fort Vaux, up to the moment when the remnant of the intrepid garrison, deprived of their last means of resistance, surrendered to the victors. I have described at length the engagements of June 2nd and 3rd. The fighting was continued on the following days with unparalleled stubbornness and ferocity. The situation was such that within the fort there had been formed, so to speak, a second fort, which the French, utterly reckless of their own lives, defended to the very last gasp. After blowing up the heavy door opening onto the corridor, which led to the western observing station at the barracks of the gorge, the Germans advanced step by step in the corridor. It was very dark, only 90 centimeters wide and 1.5 meters high. The French had raised a barricade of sandbags 2 yards deep and had set up a machine gun behind it. It was now essential to blow up the barricade in order to fall upon another a few yards farther on. Thus, the French were pushed back step by step over a distance of 25 yards. Near the gorge, the courtyard of the barracks had previously formed a concrete platform about 5 yards thick above the underground corridors and magazines, but it was now only a huge plowed-up crater. The heavy shells, even in this crater, had hollowed out a sort of funnel, at the bottom of which a narrow opening, pierced through the last vault, seemed as if it might give access to the interior of the structure. The French, till then completely screened from above and entirely shut in, were suddenly in great danger of being smoked out through this opening. The bombardment that overwhelmed the fort, however, made observation almost impossible for us. The French were the first to notice, from the interior, that the bombardment had almost entirely staved in a ceiling. They at once occupied the edge of the funnel, stopped up the hole with sandbags, and installed a machine gun. Thus they commanded a portion of that broken country, which now constituted the top of the fort. In consequence, the German communications with this top part, which had before this been unhampered, were now somewhat restricted, nor could they manage to come close enough to overwhelm the new pivot point with bombs. Among the French, the signs of hunger and thirst became more and more marked. Some succeeded in escaping, by the ditch of the gorge, this was still in their hands, towards the Montagne Wood in front of Fort Souville. In this direction lay the first line of French infantry. By this route, too, the commandant of the fort, when he had no more carrier pigeons, sent liaison officers. The underground telephone communications had been destroyed by heavy shells. On June 5th and 6th, the position of the French garrison grew steadily worse. The number of dead, and especially of wounded, increased with rapid strides. At last, there were no more than 100 pints of water left, even for the wounded. Those who had not been wounded had not a drop, and had eaten scarcely anything since the 4th. Yet the French continued to fire from the direction of the gorge, through the embrasures in the barracks and those in the ditch, at every target that offered itself. In this way, the German garrison of Fort Vaux suffered losses. Other losses, by no means negligible, were inflicted upon it by the continual flanking fire directed against the fort from the infantry tactical point, situated quite close at hand to the west. It was provided with a field gun. Similarly, the high-perched battery of Damloop on the south opened a very troublesome bombardment. On the afternoon of June 6th, the position of the Germans became extremely hazardous. The casemates which they occupied were assiduously peppered, at first with gas projectiles, somewhat later by heavy shells. The two bombardments were clearly the forerunners of an infantry counterattack aiming at the recapture of the earthwork from the southwest. This attack, however, was brought to naught by the overpowering effects of the German curtain fire, which opened as soon as the attack was started. Today, at dawn, the French garrison surrendered through the medium of its commandant. The prisoners who are beginning to come in are the living image of misery. Kurt von Redden, unquote. The text, which has been suitably edited, calls for some brief comments. The engagement before the fort on June 2nd is pictured as quite separate from the fighting of the previous day round the Hardemont salient, Fumin Wood, and the line of entrenchments, and, on the same day, at Damloop and by the Damloop Battery. As a matter of fact, it forms an integral part of all this fighting. It was the retreat of the details, placed west and east of the fort and overwhelmed by numbers, that allowed the enemy to approach the transverse passages. The number of cannon and machine guns allotted to the defense of these transverse passages is doubled in the German version. The northern ditch, not having been swept by fire, became for the enemy a sort of stronghold. The anomalous situation of a commandant of the fort on top and another inside, the one French, the other German, was not new. It had arisen, though vice versa, on May 22nd, 23, and 24th at Fort Douaumont, where General Manjan's troops occupied the superstructure and a portion of the casemates. It was on June 4th, towards noon, that the Germans, above the barricade of sandbags, were able to hurl liquid fire and asphyxiating gases. The German account informs us of a remarkable episode in the resistance, or rather completes the reports of an artillery observer who signaled on June 6th that the armored turret of the fort would be gutted. Not only were the besieged shut in and suffocated with smoke, but the ceiling gave way and fell upon them. An opening was made in the vault which protected them. They were the first to notice it, and partly stopped up the fissure with sandbags, but succeeded in installing a machine gun, which battered down a part of the superstructure and seriously interfered with the enemy's progress. This machine gun was so skillfully worked that it did not allow the assailants to approach and cripple its fire with bombs. This incident may be assigned to June 5th or 6th for Cadet Buffet's report, which summarizes the life of the fort up to the night of the 4th-5th, makes no mention of it. Thus, up to the last moment, the energy and ingenuity of the defenders did not cease to be exerted to the full. There was no plan for a counteroffensive on our part on the afternoon of June 6th. Our attack of the 6th at 2 in the morning had just and only just failed. That of the composite brigade could not take place until the morning of the 8th. On the evening of June 6th, it was, on the contrary, a furious enemy attack in the neighborhood of Vaux that was shattered under our fire. Finally, is it possible reasonably to compare with the defense kept up for 6 days under the frightful conditions already described? The feat admirable, no doubt, but far easier to explain of the attacking troops, who were relieved, revictualled, supplied with water, even if only by rainwater, for there were several showers, and breathed an air which was not tainted and foul. The true victor in the contest should be mentioned, and the German account as good as names him when it says, "Those who were not wounded had not had a drop of water for 2 days. Not a drop of water, in the corridors poisonous with the smoke from bombs and the asphyxiating gases. The true victor in the contest was thirst."
2. The final effort.
The mountains are lofty, dark, and huge, the valleys deep, the torrents swift. Behind and in front of the army the trumpets ring, and all seem to answer the horn. The emperor rides in anger, and the French, wrathful and gloomy, ride with him. There is not one who does not weep and wail, not one who does not pray to God to guard Roland until they arrive together at the battlefield and smite valiantly in his company. But what good is it? All this is useless. They have tarried too long to arrive in time. Charlemagne's trumpets will not have power to wake Roland at Roncevaux. On June 7th, the fort no longer answers the appeals by visual signaling. The German communiqué has announced its capture, but had they not already announced it on March 9th? The High Command will not surrender except to evidence. It needs certainty before it will give up the idea of delivering the garrison. True, the mangled fort is merely a point in the front and has no longer any value in itself, but perhaps it still shelters Frenchmen under its unyielding vaults. On the 7th, General Nivelle, commanding the Second Army, addresses the following order to the contingent entrusted with the operations in the Vaux area. The composite brigade placed at the disposal of Colonel Savy, consisting of the 2nd Regiment of Zouaves and the Colonial Regiment of Morocco, has been entrusted with the noblest mission that a French force can wish for, that of going to the aid of its comrades in arms, who are valiantly doing their duty under tragic circumstances. Chosen out from the heroic army of Verdun among those most worthy of so glorious an enterprise, the 2nd Regiment of Zouaves and the Colonial Regiment of Morocco, supported by a powerful artillery, inspired by the unconquerable will to pursue their task to the end, will approach the enemy with their usual magnificent dash and will add fresh laurels to those that already cover their flag. The nation will know how to show them its gratitude. Good luck, comrades, and long live France. R. Nivelle. The day of June 7th is devoted to the final preparations. The battalions possess bombs, rockets, Bengal fire signals, as well as a second water bottle of 4 pints per man. The distribution of cartridges is completed. Each man must carry provisions for 4 days, for one cannot reckon on the possibility of revictualling. Finally, the orders are read out to each company so that no man may fail to be alive to the importance of the task in hand. Their comrades are waiting for them to come to their rescue. The approach march is made under the worst possible conditions. It is raining, the ground is soaked, and the night is pitch dark, so that the guides go astray, and the entry of the 3 companies into line is delayed. The attack is to be launched at 10 past 4 a.m. 1 hour previously, the enemy himself starts a bomb attack and returns to the charge a second time against Dualin's battalion at the Belfort Trench. He is driven back, but not until he has caused some confusion in our ranks. Nevertheless, at daybreak, the Zouaves and the Colonial Infantry close with the enemy with their usual magnificent dash. Doubtless, the hope of bringing succor to the defenders of Vaux is a very slender one. All the signs, in fact, go to prove that it is too late. If the German wireless message which announced the capitulation must be received with caution, the observing stations have noticed changes in the aspect of the vaults. In front of rooms 7 and 8, the bomb-proof shelter of sandbags or stones is almost entirely destroyed. Under the tornado of fire, for the enemy knows how to keep what he has won, our infantrymen advance. They want to go on until they get into touch with their comrades. They will go on. A shell penetrates into the CO's headquarters. The telephone apparatus remains intact, but the operator has both hands cut off by a splinter. He holds out the stumps to his chief and apologizes. I can no longer telephone. Like the attack of June 6th, that of the composite brigade succeeds in encircling the fort. The enemy, however, occupies the superstructure, and his machine guns work great havoc in our ranks. His reinforcements are constantly coming up. The battalion on the right can only just hang on to the terrain after very slow progress. In the center, the advance continues up to the ditches of the fort. It is at this moment that the German machine guns do us the most serious damage. The leaders of the expedition fall one after the other, among them Major Gilbert and Major Jérôme de Mouy. The latter was a cavalry officer who had passed the staff college. He had returned from Morocco and been awarded a staff appointment, but asked for the command of a battalion of Zouaves. The 2 battalions, deprived of their officers, are compelled to give up the scheme of recapturing the fort and to entrench themselves in the parallel lines from which they started. Suddenly, an explosion occurs in the fort, and a dense black smoke issues from casemate 5. There is no human being left alive in this last stronghold. At 8 o'clock in the morning, the battalion of the Colonial Regiment, which acts as a support, still has no precise information about the operation that has been embarked upon, save that the 2 attacking battalions have not returned. Hence, they have had to advance, and they need munitions to ward off the imminent counterattacks. A fatigue party of 80 men is told off, under the command of a lieutenant and of Cadet Jacques Bégun. They carry grenades, rockets, and Bengal fire to stake out our lines. Their progress can be followed in detail, thanks to Cadet Begun's notes, from which I will quote a passage. He too, later on, will be among the chroniclers of the war. A son of Count Begun, whose historical learning is well known, he has two brothers serving with the colors. One of them, like himself, belongs to that heroic colonial regiment of Morocco, which distinguished itself at Dixmude in December 1914, and which, in the Battle of Verdun, added new luster to its crown of glory. From Cadet Begun's notebook. Quote, June 8th. So we have started in miscellaneous contingents to fulfill one of the most perilous missions, one where there is need of mutual knowledge among the men concerned and of good officers and NCOs who have confidence in you. The guide marches slowly at our head. The men know their orders. All must follow. We go through a copse of dense undergrowth, where a deep communication trench is hidden, a place that cannot be taken under the enemy's fire. We sink in the watery mud up to our calves. All is going well. We have marched up the counterslope and are once more facing the German sausages. At this point begins the zone of curtain fire and of mathematical pounding, which stops only at the French first lines. Having come to the end of the road, we climb the steep slope leading to the ridge. Already the trees and shrubs have been blasted by the firing. The battering process begins. But the German sausages have not yet seen us, and we endure the usual punishment. Barely 50 or 60 shells fall to the right and to the left of the little communication trench. Before crossing the ridge, we take a brief rest. The first contingent, in front, continues its journey little by little. Suddenly the guide says to me, "Where am I to lead you?" "To the first line," I am told. But I've got to stop at the colonel's headquarters. He does not know the way to the first line. We advance all the same. Here we are on the plateau where so much blood has been spilt. The communication trenches have become mere tracks. The forest, a few sparse trunks stripped of their branches. The soil is made up of scraps of all kinds, and the corpses, lying in batches just as they fell, are in every conceivable attitude. I bid my men follow me, jumping across the shell holes, and we begin marching for 200 yards. At this moment, the guide stops us. Here on the right is the communication trench leading to the colonel's place. I still insist, but I have to go to the first line. I don't know the way. I am going to the colonel's quarters, and in less time than it takes to tell, he hurries away in that direction. What can we do? The men are restless and won't march without a guide. We all rush in the direction of the colonel's quarters. In places, the communication trench cannot be traced, for it is chock full of corpses. All classes of troops are there: engineers, foot sloggers, colonials. In this blend of mud and dead bodies we mark time, and all that amid an acrid smell of blood and putrefying flesh. Our nerves are on edge. We begin to become the supermen that we shall be when the gunpowder has scorched us. We come to a relief post for scouts. Our guide is here. I am on the point of scolding him severely and asking for an explanation, when a substitute comes to lead us, this time to the first line. This fellow actually does know the way. We about turn to go back again upon the road towards Fort Vaux. The men are tired out. We break off for a rest. Urged by the guide, who maintains that the faster we go, the better it will be for us, we resume our march. Once again, we are on a good road. The first fatigue party, led on the direct route by its guide, is far on ahead. It has passed the plateau and is now descending the slope of the ravine of death. At this moment, the Boks begin to aim at them and start curtain fires. A rain of steel, projectiles of all calibers, proceeds to fall. Everywhere one sees things flying in the air. Forward. It is a terrible dance of death. The men begin to spread out. If I stop, they will not start off again. The whole countryside is ablaze with sunlight, an unrivaled opportunity for taking a splendid photograph. In the background, on the left, Fort Vaux. On the right, the Wover Plains. On the left, the few tree stumps that mark what was once La Cayette Wood, blackened with 210 rounds of gunfire. In the foreground, the stricken field where the shell holes adjoin each other, full to the brim with dead. And everywhere, great geysers, as it were, of earth and war material leap into the air under the impact of the shells. It was a unique scene and so easy to photograph since it was a part of my duties to do so, but my camera was at Fort Tavannes. When the onslaughts upon the entrenchments that he was guarding were at their height, Captain Delvert admired the pose of a bomb thrower in action. A soldier of the 142nd who managed to get away from Fort Vaux in describing the attack by flames, gas, and explosive petards, and the giving way of the door, and the men flying in the air, and the boats rushing in, and Lieutenant Bazzi barring the corridor to them, cannot help giving vent to the exclamation, "It was superb." Cadet Baguin, leading his fatigue party under the geysers caused by the shells, feels sorry that he has not his camera with him. Such are the undying characteristics of our race, ever in love with beauty, ever desirous, under the most adverse conditions, of seeing life and realizing it to the full.
3. The harvest of the future.
Vaux is lost, for the time being, but Vaux will be regained, and the Battle of Verdun is being won day by day. Day by day, the meaning of the Verdun battle grows clearer. The infantryman who only knows his trench mates is an atom of a vast army distributed over all the fronts. His blood and sweat will mingle in history with the blood and sweat of his unknown and remote brothers. A scrap of disputed territory, which seems to the men involved an end in itself, is really nothing but a point in the vast shifting front where the two great forces of the world are at grips. On June 12th, 5 days after the capture of the fort, the commander-in-chief informs the Verdun troops of the Russian victories in Bukovina and Galicia through the following army order. The plan matured by the councils of the coalition is now in full course of being carried out. Soldiers of Verdun, it is to your heroic resistance that this consummation is due. It is this resistance that was the essential condition, and it is on this resistance that our coming victories depend. For it was this resistance that has created over the whole theater of the European war a situation that will soon bring about the final triumph of our cause. The enemy is now held and will have to submit to our laws and accept our maneuvers. On March 10th, the enemy climbs the northern slopes of Fort Vaux. He is now only 200 or 300 yards off the counterscarp. To cross those 200 or 300 yards will take him 3 months. 3 months of superhuman exertions, of ceaseless attacks, of an inconceivable outlay of munitions and incredible losses among her young men, the flower of the nation. 3 months, as if the war had no other object than this. And during those 3 months, the coalition finishes concerting, preparing, and carrying out its plans. Fighting takes place in front of the fort, above and within it, from June 2nd to 7th. On the 4th, the first Russian offensive is launched south of the Preface. It at once forces Austria to abandon its own offensive against the Trentino. There is fighting in front of Verdun from February 21st, and fighting goes on there during June and July. The Italian offensive on the Trentino opens on June 25th, while that on the Isonzo begins during the early days of August. The Franco-British offensive on the Somme starts on July 1st, and the Central Russian offensive on July 3rd. Soldiers of Verdun, it is to your heroic resistance that this consummation is due. In War and Peace, Prince Bagration, in the course of a battle, hears bad news, but his coolness astonishes and reassures the aides-de-camp who bring it. He has an unswerving confidence in Russia's future. A temporary setback cannot make him any less certain of the final triumph. Merely at the sight of him, those who approached him with anxious looks began to recover their calm. This gives us a clue to the comforting words heard at Verdun in March, when the fort was swept by the storm for the first time. You need feel no uneasiness, for the future is taking shape. The fort played its part before the inviolate citadel of Verdun. And while it was keeping the enemy in check, the storm clouds were gathering elsewhere, some day to burst and humble the German might in the dust. Hapless Fort of Vaux, a stronghold reduced to ashes, a marvel of endurance, you who pulsated like a human heart, the whole world had its eyes riveted on you for the space of a few days. The whole world was not in error when it ascribed to you that significance which your courage enhanced. You were minister to plans whose full tenor you did not know, and today you play your part in the operations that are unfolding themselves and will continue to unfold themselves. Land that has been overrun by the lava of volcanoes shows an unparalleled fertility when the lava has passed. Upon your tortured soil, a harvest of victories will spring up, and from your defense will gush forth a fresh and inexhaustible fount of French heroism.
This concludes The Last Days of Fort Vaux, March 9th to June 7th, 1916, by Henry Bordeaux. We hope you've enjoyed this volume. For more military history audiobooks, visit Intonio.net and subscribe to Major Antonio's YouTube channel. Thank you for listening, and so long.